World Soccer Verse presents The World History of Football. Note: please use the links available under the content section in the written description of this World History of Football to jump to specific sections if you wish. Otherwise, you are welcome to enjoy the entire video, as it is full of little-known facts and tidbits about the history of football, and English football in particular. So, let's get started. Football, or soccer as it's known in the US, is the world's most popular sport by far. With at least 3.5 billion fans, and roughly 240 million players worldwide at the moment, positioning the sport firmly as one of the top 10 richest sports in the world. But just how did this very entertaining game, with its magical fancy footwork, amazing goalkeeping, and rocket-like shots from the feet of the players, evolve? Where did it start? Most of us will think that's an easy question, and probably immediately think of England as the place where this great game had its beginnings. In a sense, that would be right, as it was England where the modern football game, the one we know and love, was molded and shaped into what it is today, beginning in upper-class public schools in the era of the 1700s. However, the origins of this great game go back further. Much further. Back more than 3,000 years to Mesoamerica, where the first game to be played using a ball was popular. This was more like a volleyball game though, and at times losing a game meant being sacrificed to the gods if you were the loser. I wonder how much fun that was. The next games that we know of were played roughly 2,000 years ago, beginning with the ancient Chinese in the Han Dynasty era, who played a game called Cuju. This was a competitive ball game, and the first one that involved the kicking of a ball by the players, who had to kick the ball through an opening and into a net. As in the modern football game, the use of hands was not allowed. I wonder if there were any players back then who could rival the likes of Pelé, Michel Platini, Diego Maradona, or any of our current football stars today. What do you think? Variations of Cuju were played in Japan and Korea as well. The Greeks had a football-like game of their own around 2000 BC, which they called episkiros. The Romans later adapted this to create their own game, called harpastum. Both the Greek and the Roman games were more team-oriented than the Asian games, and were quite violent, being more akin to a very rough form of rugby than to modern football. Other forms of football-like games were reported to have been played by various other peoples, such as the Inuit people of Greenland in the 1500s, and the indigenous Australian Aborigines in the 1880s. Well, that's about it for the older, more ancient forms of our beloved game. Now, let's take a look at how the modern form of football evolved in England. It is possible that the original idea for this kind of game came to England during the time of the Roman conquest and occupation of the country. There are reports of boys playing a kind of football game in London, going as far back as the year 1170. This form of football was usually played in the meadows and on the roads, and could involve large groups of people, sometimes as many as 300 to 500 people. It was also quite rough and violent, taking place in large areas of towns, and involving not just kicking the ball, but also such tactics as punching it with the fists as well. On occasion, the games became so violent that it caused damage to towns, and even led to the death of players. Probably the reason for it being called mob football. Interestingly, some of these early games were not played just for fun, but instead could be used to settle a dispute, or even used as a kind of pagan ritual. The adverse effects caused by this game on the good citizens and property of the realm led to it being banned in London by King Edward II in April 1314, then completely banned all over the country by his son, King Edward III, in 1349. A succession of such bans followed, with Richard II in 1389, Henry IV in 1401, Edward IV in 1477, and Henry VIII in 1540. All of these bans were only partially successful though, as the love of football just would not die. We've now come to the end of part 1 of this world history of football, with special emphasis on English football. I hope you have learned something new about the history of English football and found value in part 1. In part 2, we will continue to explore this history, covering aspects including the creation of the rules of English football, the first football associations, the beginnings of professional football, the first league games, and one of the most notorious football riots in football history. See you in part 2 of the history of football.